City seminar on indoor air quality in New Zealand homes and schools. My name is Michael Baker from the University of Otago, and I'll be chairing this session. First, the usual health and safety announcements. In the event of an earthquake, you know the drill, duct cover, hold. If we have to evacuate the building, there's 2 exits at the back of this building, and you can exit out there. This only leads you underground, so don't go there. And in terms of the organisation today, we've got 2 speakers who will talk each for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for discussion. So I'm really delighted to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Julie Bennett, who's a research fellow at the University of Otago. She has a wide range of research interests, and as we'll hear today, with a particular focus on the quality of indoor air and its health effects. So over to Julie.
Tēnā koutou, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you all here and to have so many people who are interested in hearing about indoor air quality. So to start off, I'm just going to give an outline of what is air quality and why I'm so interested in the indoor environment. I'm then going to give an example of some monitoring we did here at a school in Wellington before I hand over to Perry, who's going to talk about indoor air quality in our homes in Wellington. So before we can really talk about air quality, we really need to understand what is air. So the average adult breathes 12 to 20 times a minute and takes in 11,000 litres of air every day. I'm sure you can all appreciate that if we don't breathe within about 3 minutes, we will die. So air is very important. Air itself is made up mainly of nitrogen, oxygen, and it's got some other gases in there at lower levels, argon and carbon dioxide. So when I'm talking about air quality, what I'm really talking about is, are there any other things at high concentrations in the air that isn't actually air? Some of the things that can get in air are called air pollutants, and these come in different forms. The first form are gases, things such as carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds or VOCs, nitrous oxides, ozones. The next thing that can impact on our air quality are particles. So particulate matter is made up of a mixture of liquids and solids that are clumped together. And these can come in larger particles, particulate matter 10, or smaller, particulate matter 2.5, or smaller again, the ultrafine particles. We can also have biological air pollutants, bacteria, viruses, molds, dust mites, pollens. And all of these air pollutants can be influenced by things such as temperature, humidity, the landscape, whether there are hills or valleys, our weather, whether it's really windy. So where do these air pollutants come from? Often when we think of air pollution, we think of vehicle emissions. But actually, there's a lot of natural sources of air pollutants. Volcanoes, wildfires. We've also got, as I mentioned, things like plants, pollens, mold, spores. We have a lot of dust storms in countries such as Africa. Also, America has a lot of radon. When the Earth's crust breaks down, it produces radon into the air. New Zealand has a lot of sea salt in our air because we are surrounded by water. And then we have the man-made sources. So these are our vehicles, cars, trucks, planes, ships. We also have sources from factories, from industrial processes and manufacturing. Power plants, particularly those that burn coal, produce a lot of air pollution. We also have air pollution coming from things such as agricultural burn-offs. And why is this all important? Well, as I said, we breathe 12 to 20 times a minute. So what we're breathing in is really important because it's going into our bodies and into our lungs. The World Health Organization states that around 91% of the world's population live in places where the air quality guidelines are exceeded. It's children who are particularly vulnerable to these effects of air pollution. It's also known that around a third of all respiratory hospitalisations in children aged 1 to 4 are a result of exposure to human-made air pollution. On top of that, 7 million people die every year as a result of exposure to air pollution. And while a lot of this is occurring in countries such as China and India, where the levels are really, really high, there are deaths occurring in other places that it isn't so obvious. I'll also note that 3.8 million of those deaths are actually related to exposure to household air pollution. The World Health Organization estimates that air pollution is the greatest environmental risk to humans. So how are the people dying? Well, of all lung cancer deaths, 29% of them are attributable to exposure to air pollution. 24% of deaths from stroke are attributable to exposure to air pollution. And the same with 25% of heart disease deaths, and 43% of lung diseases are also attributable to exposure to air pollution. It's not all doom and gloom though. Here in New Zealand we do have cleaner energy sources. We tend to use electricity and gas for our heating and our cooking. And we also use hydro power to generate power and windmills, as opposed to coal-fired power plants and as opposed to other countries that cook on wood and coal. However, I think we're not out of the clear, and in 2012 a health and air pollution study in New Zealand estimated that exposure to particulate matter 10 from human-made sources was responsible for 1,000 premature deaths. Just to put this in context, the road toll is around 300 premature deaths per year. As well as deaths, we have extra hospitalisations, particularly for cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. As well as these things, people can have their normal day-to-day activities restricted. People, particularly who have asthma, may feel the effects of when air pollutants are higher. So I'm just going to turn to the indoor environment, and why is the indoor environment important? Well, people spend up to 90% of their time indoors, and this is particularly true for the very young and the elderly, who are particularly vulnerable to the effects of air pollution. So the indoor environment, we have prolonged exposure to these pollutants. Inside also, we have higher levels of air pollutants than we do outside. This is because they build up, and without really good ventilation, they aren't able to exit the buildings. The inside also has two sources of air pollutants. You have infiltration from the outside, so all of the things I've just mentioned from your vehicle emissions and wood fires and your natural sources can all just seep in through your house through cracks. You've also got your indoor sources, so your indoor sources from your cooking appliances, your heating, and also you've got building products that are putting out things like volatile organic compounds, and your cleaning products. You've also got, often inside, you've got different pets and moulds that are putting off extra pollutants into the indoor environment. So when I talk about the indoor environment, I'll just outline the things I'm really referring to. I'm referring to homes, workplaces, schools, early childhood education, public and private buildings, so libraries, hospitals, aged care facilities. So this is the site where we did the monitoring at the school, and the reason I was particularly interested in looking at a school environment is, as I mentioned earlier, children are particularly vulnerable to the health effects of air pollution because they've got larger lungs in comparison to their body sizes, and they're breathing in more rapidly than adults do. The other thing more recently is there's been a lot more evidence come out between the links between cognitive development in children and exposure to high levels of air pollution. Studies in Spain have been showing that children going to schools that had high levels of air pollution had about a year's less educational achievement than children going to schools with low levels of air pollution. There's also more links coming out between high air pollution exposure at school and behavioural problems within children. So this is the school site, and the school itself was actually knocked down in 2012 because it was an earthquake risk. And at that time they brought on prefabricated classrooms for the children. These tend to be designed to be temporary, but they often last in our school grounds for a lot longer than intended. They also tend to be uninsulated, single glazed, underheated, and windows in schools tend not to be opened. This is not a problem of this school or in particular, it's known throughout New Zealand and throughout the world that people in schools just don't seem to open windows. So, whoops, just go back, sorry. Just meant to go for the pointer. So this here is a main arterial road, and there is lights here and here. So the problem with that is you get cars idling outside, particularly at peak traffic times. This road has around 16,000 vehicles pass through it every day. Also across here, there is a bus stop that, where people obviously get on and off buses, so you have buses idling there for a lot of the day. So what do we want to do? We wanted to first of all measure our air pollutants, and we wanted to work out where these air pollutants were coming from. So to do this, well, we took the measures of the air pollutants, PM2.5 and PM10. We also took measures of temperature and humidity and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is what you breathe out, and it can make a room feel stuffy, and you can feel very sleepy if the levels get high. We also took samples onto filters to work out what elements were in these samples to work out what sources were in the particulate matter. We also did the same outdoors because we wanted to look at the relationship between the indoor and the outdoor environment. So this is what the setup looked like inside, and you can see we've put them all in cages to stop inquisitive children playing with the buttons. And this is what the monitoring system looked like outside. And this is what the equipment looks like to work out what the sources are. So this works out what the elements were out of our samples. So we discovered that there were around 30 elements that we could identify. So these are the findings, which are restricted to the school day, between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. So particulate matter 2.5, the small particles, were pretty good. They were below the recommended level of 10. The PM10, the larger particles, they weren't so good. At 30, they were above the recommended level of 20, and they exceeded this level for about 90% of the school day. Temperature was pretty good. It's recommended to be around 18 or above, and it only dropped, so at 19 it was pretty good, and it dropped about a fifth of the school day, which, taking into account lunch times and break times, is about right. Humidity was 60%. This is about normal for New Zealand, which tends to be between 40 to 60%. Carbon dioxide levels, at 800-ish, they were below the recommended level of 1,000, but they did exceed this level for about 2/3 of the school day. And this is really important when you're in an environment for learning. You need to be able to think clearly and not feel sleepy. Nitrogen dioxide levels were way too high. They should be below 40, and they exceeded that level for about 95% of the school day. Nitrogen dioxide is a really good tracer of vehicle emissions. There's been other monitoring that's been done along this road also that's also shown high levels of nitrogen dioxide. So taking the carbon dioxide, we can work out what the ventilation rates are. So how much airflow is in the classrooms to try and help pollutants escape. The red line there is the level that they should be above for if you're meeting the ASHRAE standard of 8 litres per second for ventilation. And in this classroom, that was met about 1/3 of the day. So the ventilation rates were lower than they should be. So the next thing we did was we worked out where were the sources coming from. So we had three main sources, and we worked these out by working out what elements and what we could associate to each source. So on the left there is PM2.5, the smaller particles, and on the right is PM10. The first source, we decided to call it classroom dust. This was mainly made up of silica and aluminium, and it's pretty much a soil. The next main source was marine aerosol. As I said, we're surrounded by water, and this you would find in many places throughout New Zealand. This is mainly chlorine, and this happens when sea salt interacts with sunshine. The next main source was from traffic pollution, and we knew that it was from traffic pollution because it's mainly made up of black carbon and sulphur. So when we look at each particle, so the particles, the PM2.5, and we work out what they're really made up of, we found that for these smaller particles, over half of them were made up from the traffic pollution. And when we look at the larger particles, we found that the thing that was mainly influencing this and making these particles up, it was the classroom dust, or the soil. As I said, we measured outdoor things also, and when we looked at the outdoor source and compared it against the classroom dust, we saw that these two things were unrelated. And when we looked a little bit further at the diurnal variation, which pretty much means if you're looking through the day and the days, as you can see the top here, there's a bit of a pattern that it's going up at around 7 a.m. and it's rising, and then it's coming back down again about 5 p.m. And this happens Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and on the weekend, when the children aren't in the classroom, not much is happening. But when we look at the outdoor levels, there's not really a pattern. It's a bit random, so it's probably more being influenced by weather and things that are happening outside. So in conclusion, we found really high levels of PM10 in these classrooms, and these were a lot higher than our outdoor levels. And we concluded that this was actually coming from children bringing soil in from outside into the classroom, and this was being resuspended as the children were moving about the classrooms. I'd also just like to say that I think that these things would be very similar in any other schools throughout New Zealand. This isn't unique to this school. It is, I would think, similar to other schools. The main source of PM2.5 was coming from traffic. I also think this is probably would be similar in any other sort of urban setting for the schools. And this was backed up with high levels of nitrogen dioxide. The building had poor ventilation, which, as I mentioned, is really important to have lower levels of carbon dioxide so children can concentrate in these environments when they're learning. So some suggestions to help air quality in schools. Well, carbon dioxide, we could open windows. I know that the Ministry of Education now has some regulation around requiring automatic opening windows with carbon dioxide monitors on them in new builds. However, I'd like to see a little bit of evaluation done of how effective these are and if they're being used as they should be. PM10, you could have something like kind of a wet foot bath that people walk through before they go into the class, or they could remove their shoes. I have heard of issues, though, removing shoes with drawing pins and feet. There could be a bit of a change in cleaning routine. You could do more wet washes. New schools can consider having smooth flooring, maybe in particularly areas that are walked on a lot. The particulate matter 2.5 and nitrogen dioxide is slightly more tricky because it's influenced by outside influences to the school. So what the school could do itself is they could plant more trees. Trees are fantastic absorbers of air pollution. They could ask for the bus stop to be moved. If it was further away, the source of it would be more diluted as it came to the school. And when Ministry of Education are planning new buildings and new schools, they could plan them away from main arterial routes. So the school itself is now rebuilt, and I'm really pleased to say that none of these windows open to the road front here, they're all sealed. It also has a mechanical ventilation system in it that filtrates air pollution. So that's great. I was really interested when the building was being built about the volatile organic compounds. So these are the things that come out of your building products, your carpets, your paints. So I was allowed to measure them, and they should be below the red line there. And the children actually moved in here. So I was really pleased to see that the levels actually were below the recommended level when they moved in, and they did actually drop away quite quickly, and they remained dropped away. If anyone is interested, this has all been written up in a paper, and I'm happy to share that with anyone. And I'd just like to say a really big thanks to the Newtown School, to the principal and the Board of Trustees who allowed this monitoring to happen, and to Brands' support, and GNS Science, and to all the people that helped lend me equipment or give me advice. And now I'm going to hand over to Perry to talk about air pollution in homes.
Thanks, Julie. Julie's given a fantastic introduction to the science behind this, so I'm not going to cover it again for you. So it was advertised as air pollution in New Zealand homes, but really the study was in Wellington. So, but I think we can draw some parallels across the country to what we saw. And also you'll see there's a lot of parallels of what Julie was talking about in terms of air pollution indoors in schools. And this is going to apply to workplaces and other public spaces as well across New Zealand. Right, so I mean, in terms of the context, examining indoor air pollution is useful for exposure analysis and looking at the health impacts, and also for air quality management. As Julie said, we spend 80 to 90% of our time indoors, and what we're exposed to indoors is highly relevant from a health and epidemiology perspective in terms of the health impacts on society and the costs, the socioeconomic costs that go along with those poor health outcomes. So for this study, the key questions we were looking at were what were the primary sources of our PM as particulate matter pollution in our homes, what the commonalities were across the homes, the different homes, and what the interaction between indoor and outdoor air quality was. And just as an outline for my talk, I'm just going to look at the, can we better? Okay, the location and the houses studied, the indoor pollutants and their sources, and were they warm, dry homes? There's been a lot of push to having warm, dry homes in New Zealand. That's a critical thing for healthy living. And also the impact of occupancy and ventilation, and as Julie was saying, that has an important impact on our health as well. And then I'll look at the infiltration of outdoor sources and a brief summary. So the study homes are spread across the Porirua, Wellington area. It was chosen to represent a selection of the New Zealand building stock. Old and new homes included state houses, homes with inbuilt garages, because we're interested in the effect of motor vehicles parked in garages as a source of air pollution. And we chose 7 houses from Porirua through to Wainuamata. We only did 15 days monitoring in each house because of the intensive nature of it. And just a point here that none were immediately adjacent busy roads, so we're not really going to see an effect of the motor vehicle influence in these houses that might be if you were living next to arterial roads. We recorded a range of parameters. I'm not going to go through this, but it just gives you the outline of the age range, and one of the houses had a smoker in it, so that was an interesting comparison. Our monitoring setup is very similar to the schools, had a range of indoor and outdoor monitoring devices, and to record all the parameters, mainly we're collecting high-resolution samples of air particulate matter, and then we were analysing that using nuclear analytical techniques to determine the elemental composition. And from that compositional analysis, we can infer something about the sources. I'm just going to first start with house ventilation rates. This is a test which looks at the natural ventilation of houses. And what we found was quite surprising, but not surprising good correlation, but not surprising in terms of the ventilation rates. And the older housing stock was had a much higher natural ventilation rate than newer builds. Newer builds are down here, this is age, and the oldest stock. And that's because of the construction of the houses, how well the doors and windows seal. So now I'm going to just look at some of those fine particle concentrations indoors, and this is just really just giving an overview. All these graphs are on the same scale, and you can see that there's quite a variation over the monitoring period and the variability in peak concentrations across houses. But there was an interesting pattern in these very, very high peaks and then a drop away over that. So then when we drill down in the data a bit more, we can see on a temporal variation basis that across houses 1 to 6, there's a very regular pattern. And here, this is aggregate data across the day of the week, and this intense peak at about 6 p.m. during the day. And the shaded area is the confidence intervals in those means. So it's fairly regular across that housing, those 6 houses. House 7 had something different going on, and that's due to that significant influence of smoking. And you can see the concentrations here are quite considerably higher than. And when we break that down just on an hourly basis, you can see that intense peak at around 6 p.m. and the drop away over the days of the week. So it says something about some people's habits. It surprised us that that was so regular across. We're only talking about 7 houses, and people live in their houses, somewhat differently. But it turns out, surprisingly, that our habits are reasonably similar in the way that we live. Now, if we were to compare that data to our outdoor National Environmental Standard, we can see here, this is a sequential monitoring period across the different houses. You can see the influence of the smoking here. Now, this is the National Environmental Standard for PM10. That's at 50 micrograms meter cube for a 24-hour average. And this is World Health Organization guideline for PM2.5. Now, it's important to keep these two in mind because, as it turns out, what we were mainly monitoring indoors was this fine particle. So you can see the variability across the different houses. And if we compare that to what was actually being monitored outdoors over that time, and these are the 3 air quality monitoring stations used by Greater Wellington Regional Council to monitor outdoor air quality against the National Environmental Standard, we could see it's giving a very different picture of what people might be exposed to and perhaps the health outcomes for that. So we took that elemental data and now we can break it down into what those sources of that indoor particle pollution was. So we differentiate the sources by that compositional and a time series analysis. We can see here, and really to take home message from there, is the dominance of this 6 p.m. signal is due to cooking emissions. And that was a primary peak and primary source in houses 1 to 5. It's for the source of the peak at 6 p.m. and dominates the overall average, if you can see this average in terms of percentage composition. House 6 was an interesting case, and I'll talk about that a little bit more soon, is that the family there had meals with a family living nearby, so they didn't do much cooking at home. In fact, if we go back to house 6 here, you can see there's only one outstanding peak there. Unfortunately, in house 7, we had an equipment malfunction, and that's enough to make a scientist cry a river. There's nothing you can do about it, and you can't go back. So it's I lost data. So in house 6, the biomass combustion source, this is wood burning dominated, and I'll cover that soon, why that might be the case. Now, just looking at one of the houses in terms of this biomass combustion or wood burning, houses with burners, is that the wood burner is the main source of heating in house 4. It was in regular use. And I just compared it against the same trace for this is differentiating between the sources. So this is a cooking peak at 6 p.m. And this is the influence of the wood burner emissions in that house. I mean, I'm not saying this is house 4's wood burner. I don't think it leaked that much indoors, but they do leak somewhat indoors when you're using them. So there's a source of pollution, indoor pollution basically. And it has a different time series from the cooking peak, depending on the wood burner use. And obviously, every time you load some wood into it, there's a larger leakage into the house, and that might be responsible for some of these larger peaks as you're stoking the wood burner. And as Julia was pointing out about the crustal matter source or soil in our homes, and this is mainly a coarse particle, a PM10 particle. This is entirely unrelated to outdoors, and this is due to activities, people moving about indoors, similar to the classrooms, and this is due to probably tracking in of soil from outside, use of vacuum cleaners. Vacuum cleaners are very good at picking up coarse particles, larger particles off the floors and that. Most of the finer particles that we're talking about are just spewed back out the other end of the vacuum cleaner. So they're a fantastic resuspension unit. And of course, sweeping as well. And really it just shows, it depends on what's going on and the activity in the house. Obviously, lots of activity on a Sunday in this house. So I'm going to talk a bit about the gases that we measured at the moment. This is indoor carbon monoxide, and this is related to combustion of fuels. And as we can see, in house 1, it is entirely related to the use of a gas hob. Gas being a combustion source gives off a little bit of carbon monoxide. It's not challenging any of the World Health Guidelines for carbon monoxide. You can see here we're only getting up to about 3 ppm over a short time period, but it is related to the use of the hob. House 7 had an internal garage, and we can see here that the influence of that, of motor vehicle going in and out of that garage on the carbon monoxide levels in the lounge of that house. And as with the schools, carbon monoxide is really a measure of ventilation rates in your home. And what we've found is that in the lounge, usually fairly open, doors open, windows open, it's reasonably low. Excuse me. But coming to when people are in a bedroom, and this was consistent across all houses, is that the bedroom carbon monoxide levels at night were becoming elevated. And that's due to, and it depends on the occupancy, the number of people and bodies in that room breathing, and whether they have windows open or doors open. I mean, if you're going into a small bedroom with your windows and doors closed at night, your carbon dioxide levels are going to go reasonably high. And that may have some health implications as we cross over this health and cognition effects that recognise it kicking in at about 1,500 ppm, and we're getting up to 3,000 to 4,000 ppm at night in some bedrooms. So if you're waking up feeling tired in the morning with a headache, you might need to think about your ventilation rates in your bedroom. And also, a standard adult would lose about a litre of water by breathing a day. And so 2 adults in a bedroom at night might lose maybe 3/4 of a litre of water. And so your crying windows in the morning are probably mainly due to the moisture exhaled. And then that brings me to the warm, dry homes aspect with indoor temperature and relative humidity. On the left-hand side, let's go back. On the left-hand side here is the temperature trace average across all the houses. And it's not too bad. It's sitting between, in the lounge area, sort of 18 and 20, that's about standard. And in the bedrooms, slightly cooler. I like my bedroom slightly cooler at night to be able to sleep properly, somewhere between 15 and 20. And also relative humidity is fairly stable across, sitting at about 60 to 65. That's about the comfortable temperature for indoor air quality. But I have to say that these houses that we were able to access were all houses that had interventions in there, where they were insulated and with heating. This is not sort of like the worst of the worst or across the New Zealand housing stock. So that's a good outcome. So interventions do work, I guess, is the point there. Now I'm just going to turn our attention to the infiltration of outdoor sources to indoors. And this is really interesting because now it becomes a sort of an environmental justice thing. So what we found in House 6, it was ex-state house. It was built in 1956 and there was no wood burner in use there. It was located on the Wainuiomata Valley floor, and we know that the Wainuiomata and the valley areas in New Zealand are subject to air pollution in winter due to the use of wood burners. And what we see here is, I point out that House 6 had the highest natural ventilation rate, right? So the exchange from outdoor to indoor was reasonably rapid. And what we see here is from our monitoring that the indoor and outdoor sources of air pollution, this is now a fine particle source that has the most health effect, was essentially the same indoors as it was outdoors. So being indoors is no protection from air pollution sources out. And we can see here that the same diurnal pattern of the wood burning is very similar indoors to outdoors and typical of New Zealand outdoor urban areas during the winter. And if you see this outdoors, then you're finding that will be indoors as well. And one of the things about that is that infiltration of outdoor pollutants to indoors, with wood burning for home heating, it's a neighbourly impact. And this is some data we have from outdoors in Henderson and Auckland. It's not known for its subantarctic weather, but still it has a wintertime air pollution. And there's these three pollutants here, black carbon, arsenic and lead, that we pick up in that trace that peaks every winter. And that's from, lead is just a trace of the combustion, the soot, the smoke. Arsenic, we know, is from burning treated timber, offcuts or waste. That's CCA treated timber. And lead is from burning old painted timber. So these are bits of weatherboard or what have you that have been used as fuel. I mean, they burn really well. But there is a consequence of suddenly we now have another lead source. Lead was taken out of petrol in 1996. But since then we've had this legacy of lead in our communities from people using as fuels and wood burners. So that has implications for indoor air quality, for passive infiltration, and active for people actually doing the burning. We don't know what the exposure to these pollutants are. If you're putting this stuff in your wood burner, what is the consequences to the indoor air quality, to your family, to your children, from being exposed to some of these pollutants? And again, with infiltration of outdoor sources to indoors, size does matter. And this is just an illustration of our ubiquitous marine aerosol, or sea salt. And this is house 6 again. We can see that the fine sea salt makes its way indoors, but there is some filtering effect because it's a larger particle. And this is the larger coarse sea salt. That's not really, there's no relationship between indoors and outdoors. And even in our more modern house, we're still finding that there's a relationship between indoor and outdoor fine particle sources. So it's still infiltrating indoor. And that has implications for infiltration by particle size, and that implies that the source matters. So our combustion sources, like wood burning, motor vehicles, are basically making their way indoors unimpeded. And on top of that, we're adding whatever we found. So, just to summarise, we found that our indoor particulate matter is mainly the finer fraction, and that wood burners do leak particulate matter indoors, and there's health implications associated with that, depending on what you're burning as well. Outdoor fine particles infiltrate indoors, and that has implications for buildings and polluted urban atmospheres next to busy roads, and that our indoor exposure is higher. This is critical than outdoors, and that has implications for how we look at health and epidemiology across our society. And really, the main theme here is really the importance of building design for indoor air quality, as well as the ventilation, making sure that there's enough exchange for the occupancy, temperature, and moisture control. And thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to our collaborators and all those assisted with us in our study. Thank you very much.